To the world, he was a hero. To the FBI, a predator with a dangerous fixation on young boys. The Windsors desperately buried Mountbatten's secret gay life to protect the crown, but the dark truth is this. The bomb that killed him was likely the only thing that saved him from prison. That explosion was the violent conclusion to a life split in two, the public spectacle of the war hero, and the private, shadowed existence of a man terrified of exposure. To understand this fear, we must understand that Louis Mountbatten was not just born, he was manufactured. He was a product of the Victorian age's dying breath, a man obsessed with lineage and legacy because he had seen exactly how easily it could be destroyed. The trauma started early. Born in 1900 at Windsor Castle, he was Queen Victoria's great-grandson, but he was the wrong kind of royalty for a world at war. He watched his father, Prince Louis of Battenberg, rise to the highest rank in the Royal Navy, only to be hounded out of office in 1914 by anti-German hysteria. The young Dicky saw his father weep as he was stripped of his dignity. He saw his family forced to anglicize their name from the princely Battenberg to the artificial Mountbatten. That moment of humiliation broke something in the teenage boy, but it also forged a terrifying ambition. He decided then and there that he would reclaim everything his father had lost. He would become the first Sea Lord. He would be more British than the British. He would polish the armor of his reputation until it was so blindingly bright that no one could look closely enough to see the cracks underneath. He would become the ultimate performative Englishman. But ambition requires fuel, and in the aristocracy of the 1920s, fuel meant money. Mountbatten had the bloodline, but he didn't have the fortune required to sustain the lifestyle of a naval prince. He needed a partner who could fund his ascent. Enter Edwina Ashley. Edwina was the it girl of her generation. Her grandfather, Sir Ernest Cassell, was a financial titan, the personal banker to the king, and one of the richest men in Europe. Edwina was wild, intelligent, rebellious, and possessed a fortune that made the Mountbattens look like paupers. When they married in 1922, it was the wedding of the century. Crowds 10 deep lined the streets of London. The Prince of Wales was the best man. It was a union of supreme beauty and limitless wealth, the perfect image for the magazines. They were the golden couple destined to rule the social scene of the interwar years. Yet the facade began to crumble before the honeymoon was even over. The tragedy of the Mountbatten marriage was not that they didn't love each other. In a strange, twisted way they did, but that they were fundamentally incompatible in the one area that defines a conventional marriage, the bedroom. Mountbatten, for all his dashing looks and naval uniforms, was inexperienced and awkward. Edwina, by contrast, was a woman of voracious, complex, and high-voltage sexuality. She found him tedious. She found his obsession with naval protocol and his fussiness over uniforms unsexy. While he was trying to organize their domestic life with the precision of a military operation, she was looking for passion, for danger, for intellectual equals. By the time they returned from their honeymoon tour, the dynamic was set. Edwina was bored, and a bored Edwina was a dangerous thing. She began to have affairs. At first they were discreet, but soon they became brazen. She slept with polo players, society figures, and Americans. She would leave Mountbatten alone at parties to disappear with her latest conquest. For a man whose entire psychological makeup was built on control and reputation, this was a torture of the highest order. He was humiliated. He wrote pathetic letters to her, pleading for her attention, trying to schedule intimacy as if it were a fleet maneuver. But nothing worked. The whispers in London society began. Poor Dickie, they said. He can command a destroyer, but he can't command his wife. It was a crisis that would have destroyed a lesser man, or at least a more conventional one. But Mountbatten was a pragmatist. He realized that a divorce was impossible. It would ruin his naval career and destroy his standing at court. He needed Edwina's money, and he needed the stability of a home, even if it was a sham. So they made a deal. It was a treaty that would define the rest of their lives. They agreed to a modus vivendi, a way of living. They would remain married. They would present a united front to the cameras, to the Navy, and to the royal family. They would support each other's ambitions. But privately they were free. If Edwina wanted to take lovers, she could, provided she did not cause a public scandal. It was a radical arrangement for the 1930s, a secret pact that turned their marriage into a corporate partnership. And as Edwina drifted further into her own romantic world, eventually finding her soulmate in the Indian leader Jawaharlal Nehru, Mountbatten was left to explore his own desires. Because while Edwina's affairs were heterosexual and largely tolerated by the bohemian upper classes, Mountbatten's private life began to veer into territory that was not just socially unacceptable, but criminally illegal. The FBI files that would be compiled years later didn't care about Edwina. They cared about Dickie. As he rose through the ranks, becoming a key figure in the Allied war effort, the intelligence chatter began to pick up a specific signal. It wasn't about women. In the closed all-male world of the Royal Navy, Mountbatten was in his element. He loved the uniforms. He loved the camaraderie. He loved the hero worship he received from young sailors. Rumors began to circulate below decks. They called him Mount Bottom. It was a joke, a slur, but also a warning. There were stories of him taking a particular interest in handsome young men, of favors granted to those who caught his eye, of a looseness in his behavior that went beyond the mentorship of a senior officer. Biographers and historians have since unearthed interviews with former valets and drivers who paint a picture of a man who, having been rejected by his wife, sought validation in the arms of men. But unlike Edwina, who sought intellectual equals, Mountbatten's taste was alleged to be far more specific and far more predatory. He didn't want equals. He wanted youth. He wanted adoration. This was the dangerous secret that lay at the heart of the Mountbatten myth. He was the king's cousin, a man who would eventually become the supreme Allied commander, Southeast Asia. He held the secrets of the atomic bomb and the D-Day landings. And yet, he was walking a tightrope over a pit of blackmail and ruin. As the Second World War approached, the stakes became existential. J. Edgar Hoover, the paranoid and powerful director of the FBI, began to receive reports from London. These weren't just gossip columns, these were security assessments. One report, based on high society informants, explicitly labeled Mountbatten as unfit for certain commands due to his perversion. The Americans were terrified that the Germans or the Soviets could use this information to compromise him. By day, he is standing on the bridge of his destroyer, the HMS Kelly, projecting the image of the fearless warrior, the man who would never abandon his ship. By night, he is navigating a labyrinth of illicit encounters, terrified that one wrong look, one bitter ex-lover, or one intercepted letter could bring the entire House of Windsor crashing down. He used his marriage to Edwina as the ultimate shield. Whenever rumors about his sexuality flared up, he would point to his glamorous wife, his children, his position. "Look at me," the image said. "I am the perfect patriarch." But the open marriage was a double-edged sword. It gave him freedom, but it also stripped away the moral high ground. Their home became a chaotic, fluid environment where lovers of both sexes came and went, where the boundaries of decency were constantly tested. It was in this permissive, secretive atmosphere that the seeds of the later, more horrific allegations were sown. As Mountbatten climbed higher, from captain to admiral, from admiral to viceroy of India, the disconnect between the man and the myth widened. He was becoming a giant of history, but the shadows he cast were growing longer. And in the murky world of intelligence and state secrets, there were people who knew exactly what he was. They were watching, they were documenting, and they were waiting. The golden couple of the empire was glittering on the surface, but underneath the rot had already set in. And as the war years gave way to the complexities of the Cold War, Mountbatten's need for secrecy would lead him into dangerous alliances and dark places, places far removed from the palaces of London, places like a boy's home in Northern Ireland called Kincora. The destroyer HMS Kelly was sinking. It was May 23, 1941, during the Battle of Crete, and German Stuka dive bombers had finally found their mark. As the ship rolled over in the churning Mediterranean, Captain Louis Mountbatten, Dickie to his friends, Lord Louis to the press, clung to the bridge until the water swallowed him whole. He surfaced, oil-slicked and gasping, surrounded by the dying and the dead, and began to organize the survivors. He led them in a cheer, 3 cheers for the Kelly. It was a moment of supreme theatricality, a scene so perfect it would later be immortalized in the film In Which We Serve, with Noel Coward playing a thinly veiled version of Mountbatten. To the British public, shivering in air raid shelters and desperate for heroes, this cemented his legend. He was the unsinkable aristocrat, the warrior prince who bled alongside the common man. He was the embodiment of the spirit of the Blitz. But while the newsreels played the footage of his heroism, a very different kind of file was being compiled across the Atlantic. In the drab, fluorescent-lit offices of the J. Edgar Hoover Building in Washington, D.C., the Federal Bureau of Investigation was not cheering. They were worried. As Mountbatten's star rose, pushing him toward the Supreme Allied Command in Southeast Asia, American intelligence began to ask uncomfortable questions about the man who would soon hold the lives of hundreds of thousands of American and British soldiers in his hands. The FBI file, classified for decades and only fully brought to light in recent years through Freedom of Information Acts, tells a story that runs counter to the hero myth. It is a dossier of suspicion. To J. Edgar Hoover, a man obsessed with moral purity and the potential for blackmail, Mountbatten was a security nightmare. The concern wasn't his military competence, though that was often debated, but his moral vulnerability. In 1944, as the war reached its crescendo, the FBI conducted a series of interviews that would form the backbone of their Mountbatten file. The most damning testimony came from a high society figure, Elizabeth de la Poer Beresford, known as Baroness Deschis. She moved in the same rarefied circles as the Mountbattens. She knew the whispers, the open secrets, and the things that were never said in mixed company. Her interview with federal agents was blunt. She described Mountbatten as a man who was, in her words, known to be a homosexual with a perversion for young boys. The agents noted this with clinical detachment, typing it into the permanent record. But the implication was explosive. In the 1940s, this wasn't just a lifestyle choice. It was a criminal pathology in the eyes of the law and a fatal flaw in the eyes of the military. The file didn't stop there. It suggested that Mountbatten and his wife Edwina were people of extremely low morals. It painted a picture of a couple who, despite their royal connections, were fundamentally unstable. Hoover's agents were terrified that Mountbatten's condition, as they termed it, made him susceptible to entrapment. If the Nazis knew, or if the Soviets found out, they could own the Supreme Allied Commander. This was the terrifying reality of Mountbatten's war. He was fighting the Axis powers on one front and fighting to keep the lid on his own life on the other. He knew that the moment the war ended, the scrutiny would only intensify. He needed protection. He needed a distraction. And ironically, he found it in the very thing that had once humiliated him, his marriage. By the time Mountbatten was appointed the last Viceroy of India in 1947, charged with the impossible task of overseeing British withdrawal and the partition of the subcontinent, his relationship with Edwina had evolved into something fascinatingly complex. The jealousy of the 1920s was gone, replaced by a deep, almost professional affection. They were a team. They were Dickie and Edwina, a brand as much as a couple. India changed everything for them. It was in the sweltering heat of New Delhi that Edwina found the great love of her life, Jawaharlal Nehru, the intense, brilliant Kashmiri Brahmin who would become India's first prime minister. The relationship between Edwina and Nehru is one of history's great romances. It was intellectual, spiritual, and deeply emotional. They wrote letters to each other every single day, letters that are still preserved, filled with a longing that transcends the dry pages of history books. They were soulmates. And where was Mountbatten while his wife was falling in love with the leader of the independence movement he was negotiating with? He was right there, often in the room, smiling. He didn't just tolerate the affair, he facilitated it. He realized that Edwina's closeness to Nehru gave him a back channel to the Indian leadership that no other diplomat possessed. If Nehru was happy with Edwina, he was amenable to Dickie. It was a ménage à trois of power. There are photographs from this era that are startling in their candor. Edwina and Nehru laughing intimately, their bodies turned toward each other, while Mountbatten stands slightly apart, looking at his watch or studying a map, the benevolent manager of his wife's heart. But his acceptance of Nehru wasn't just political pragmatism, it was also a relief. If Edwina was occupied with Nehru, she wasn't asking questions about where Dickie was spending his evenings. It gave him the cover he desperately needed to pursue his own interests, which were becoming increasingly specific and risky. The Mountbatten rumors that had started in the Navy didn't vanish in the opulent palaces of the Viceroy. They just went deeper underground. While Edwina was with the Prime Minister, Mountbatten surrounded himself with a specific coterie of young men. His valets, his drivers, the handsome young aides-de-camp in their crisp white naval uniforms, these became his primary social circle. Biographer Andrew Loney, who spent years interviewing the surviving members of Mountbatten's staff for his book, The Mountbattens, Their Lives and Loves, uncovered a pattern of behavior that borders on the predatory. Former employees described a man who was obsessed with the physicality of the men around him. He would inspect uniforms with a lingering touch, adjusting collars and belts with an intimacy that made young sailors freeze in uncomfortable silence. There were stories of him inviting young men to his private quarters for late-night drinks to discuss their careers, only for the conversation to turn to personal, probing questions about their love lives and bodies. One former driver, Ron Perks, recounted how Mountbatten would insist on swimming naked with his staff, a practice that, while perhaps eccentric, was often interpreted as a power play, a way to break down the barriers of rank and introduce a sexual charge to the environment without ever explicitly crossing the line into actionable assault. This was Mountbatten's genius and his curse. He lived in the gray zone. He knew exactly how far he could push a young corporal or a lieutenant before they would dare to speak up. And who would believe them? He was the viceroy. He was the cousin of the king. To accuse him was to accuse the crown itself. He hid in plain sight. He fetishized the trappings of his office, the gold braid, the high collars, the tight-fitting ceremonial dress. He was known to design his own uniforms, obsessing over the cut and the fit to emphasize the male physique. To the public, this was just the vanity of a dashing commander. To those in the know, to the friends of Dorothy in the underground gay scene of London and the Navy, it was a signal, it was a code. Yet the psychological toll of this double life was immense. Mountbatten was a man who craved intimacy, but could only find it in transactional fleeting encounters or in the safe, unthreatening adoration of subordinates. He could never have a Nehru. He could never have an equal partner. His relationships were defined by a stark power imbalance, the master and the servant, the admiral and the sailor, the older man and the boy. As the 1950s rolled in and he returned to Britain to take up the post of First Sea Lord, the position his father had been stripped of, the danger only increased. The Cold War was freezing over. The Lavender Scare in America and Britain saw hundreds of gay men purge from government service, deemed security risks because they were vulnerable to blackmail. Mountbatten watched as colleagues were ruined. He saw the trial of Lord Montagu in 1954, a high-profile case where a peer of the realm was jailed for homosexual offenses. It sent a chill through the upper classes, but Mountbatten remained untouched. He was too big to fail. The security services, MI5 and MI6, knew about the rumors. They had seen the FBI files, but they made a calculated decision. The scandal of exposing Mountbatten would damage the monarchy more than the risk of keeping him in power. So they built a firewall around him. They vetted his staff. They monitored the press. They ensured that the unfit commander remained the face of the Royal Navy. But protection breeds arrogance. Mountbatten began to believe his own myth. He believed he was invulnerable. And as he aged, the caution that had defined his early years began to slip. The boyish charm he relied on was beginning to look like something else in an aging man. The young sailors he favored were getting younger. The rumors were no longer just about homosexuality. They were beginning to mutate into something far more sinister, something that involved children. It was during these years, the late 1950s and 60s, that the first tendrils of the Kincora scandal began to take root in the soil of Northern Ireland, while Mountbatten was advising Prince Charles on his love life, writing letters instructing the young prince to sow his wild oats. He was allegedly making visits to places that should have been off limits to any man, let alone a member of the royal family. The open marriage had served its purpose. It had allowed Edwina to die happy in 1960, clutching Nehru's letters. But for Dicky, the widower, the freedom was now absolute. There was no one left to check him, no one to warn him. He was the patriarch of the Windsors, the grandpa to the nation. And in the shadows of that towering reputation, the darker impulses were given room to grow, unchecked and unobserved, until they would eventually collide with a bomb on a fishing boat in Sligo. By the early 1960s, Mountbatten had ascended to the very pinnacle of the British military establishment, becoming the chief of the defense staff. But in his private life, the anchor had been cut away. By the early 1960s, Louis Mountbatten had become a man who existed in a rarefied atmosphere where the normal rules of gravity, moral and political, simply did not apply. He had ascended to the very pinnacle of the British military establishment, becoming the chief of the defense staff in 1959. In this role, he was the supreme commander of all British armed forces, a position of such staggering authority that he answered only to the Prime Minister and the Queen. To the public, he was the silver-haired architect of the modern military, a technocrat who was streamlining the Navy, Army, and Air Force into a unified machine. He was the elder statesman, the man who had seen it all. But in his private life, the anchor had been cut away. In 1960, Edwina died in her sleep while on a tour of Borneo. She was found clutching a packet of old letters from Jawaharlal Nehru, a poignant end to a turbulent life. Her death devastated Mountbatten, but it also untethered him. For 40 years, Edwina had been his erratic but essential counterweight. She was the one person who knew the truth of him, the one person who could look him in the eye and see Dickie rather than the Earl. Without her, he was alone in a world that was increasingly terrified to tell him no. This solitude was dangerous. A man with absolute power and no one to check his impulses is a man walking toward a precipice. In the vacuum left by his wife, Mountbatten threw himself into two distinct projects. The first was the dynastic grooming of his great-nephew, Prince Charles. He saw in the young, sensitive prince a chance to mold the future King of England in his own image, a Mountbatten Windsor, who would be tough, dashing, and popular. He became Charles's honorary grandfather, a mentor who advised him on everything from military service to his love life, famously urging him to sow his wild oats before settling down. The second project was far more shadowy, and it took him away from the palaces of London to the rugged, violent, and lawless coast of Ireland. The family's summer retreat at Classybon Castle in County Sligo had always been a sanctuary, but in the late 1960s and early 70s, it became the epicenter of a new, darker chapter. Ireland was descending into the chaos of the Troubles. Sectarian violence was tearing the North apart. Belfast was a war zone of bombings, snipers, and barricades. It was a place where law and order had fractured, and in the cracks of that broken society, predators found a hunting ground. This is where the story of Lord Mountbatten intersects with the horrific history of the Kin Kora boys' home. Kin Kora, located in a red brick Victorian building in East Belfast, was ostensibly a place of safety for vulnerable boys from broken homes. In reality, it was a dungeon. It was run by William McGrath, a fanatical loyalist and housefather who was also the leader of a sinister paramilitary group called Tara. McGrath was a man who preached a bizarre mixture of ultra-Protestantism and anti-Catholicism, but behind the religious fervor, he was running a systematic pedophile ring. For decades, the abuse at Kincora was an open secret in Belfast. Boys were trafficked. They were abused by staff and, crucially, by visitors. The allegations that link Mountbatten to Kincora are the most explosive of his entire biography. They do not come from a single source, but from a convergence of victim testimonies, intelligence leaks, and the dogged work of investigative journalists who refuse to let the story die. The central claim is terrifying in its simplicity, that Mountbatten was a VIP visitor to Kincora. One of the most harrowing accounts comes from Arthur Smith, a former resident of the home. Decades later, Smith would testify to the Historical Institutional Abuse Inquiry and speak to authors like Andrew Loney. He described a night in 1977. He was a teenager, vulnerable, and terrified. He claimed he was taken by a staff member to a location, sometimes described as the home itself, sometimes a private residence or a yacht, where he was introduced to a very important man from London. Smith did not know who the man was at the time. He only knew he was powerful, that the staff treated him with deferential fear. It was only years later, seeing a picture in a newspaper or on television, that the realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The man with the silver hair, the man with the soft aristocrat's voice, was Lord Mountbatten. The question that haunts historians is, how? How could the Queen's cousin, the former First Sea Lord, be trafficking in the abuse of children in a war zone? The answer, according to intelligence historians and former agents who have spoken off the record, lies in the murky world of MI5. By the 1970s, British intelligence was deeply embedded in Northern Ireland. They knew everything. They had bugs in the paramilitary headquarters. They had informants in the pubs. They certainly knew about William McGrath and Kincora. The honey trap theory suggests that MI5 allowed Kincora to operate because it was a useful tool for blackmail. If they could catch loyalist paramilitaries or politicians abusing boys, they owned them. They could control them. And if a member of the royal family was also involved, that was the ultimate leverage. It was the nuclear option of intelligence gathering. There is evidence to suggest that Mountbatten was monitored by his own security services during this time, not to protect him, but to contain him. The Mountbatten file had grown. It wasn't just about sailors anymore. It was about a specific predatory interest in youth that had curdled into something criminal. But in the 1970s, the instinct of the British establishment was always, without fail, to cover up. To expose Mountbatten would be to expose the rot at the heart of the system. It would confirm the worst propaganda of the IRA, that the British elite were decadent, exploitative monsters preying on the children of the occupied. So, silence reigned. The police investigations into Kincora were stifled. Files went missing. Officers who asked too many questions were transferred. And Mountbatten continued to visit Ireland every August, waving from his boat, playing with his grandchildren on the beach, while just across the border, boys in a care home lived in a state of perpetual terror. The psychological dissonance required to live this life is almost impossible to fathom. By day, Mountbatten was writing letters to Prince Charles about duty and honor. He was attending state banquets, wearing his garter sash, toasting the health of the nation. By night, if the allegations are true, he was descending into a world of absolute depravity. Did he see a contradiction? Perhaps not. The aristocracy of his generation was raised with a sense of droit du seigneur, the right of the Lord. They believed they were a different species from the common man. Rules were for other people. Morality was a construct for the middle classes. For a man like Mountbatten, who had been treated as a semi-divine figure since birth, the satisfaction of his desires may have felt like a natural entitlement. Furthermore, he was aging. The vanity that had always driven him was turning into a desperate rage against the dying of the light. He was obsessed with his fading looks, with his virility. The pursuit of young men, and potentially boys, was a way to vampirize their youth, to feel powerful in a way that medals and titles could no longer provide. The rumors were not confined to Kincora. There were whispers about his behavior on his estates in England, about the boys' nights at his home, Broadlands. There were stories about the exclusivity of his male staff, about the strange atmosphere that hung over his household. But he was protected by a force field of deference. Who would dare accuse him? In 1978, a year before his death, the tension was palpable to those who knew where to look. The RUC was becoming increasingly frustrated with the security situation around Mountbatten. They knew he was a target for the IRA, but they also knew he was a liability in other ways. His refusal to accept deeper security protection was often cited as bravery. "I will not let the bastards dictate my life," he would say. But looking back through the lens of the Kincora allegations, a different interpretation emerges. Did he refuse close protection because he was brave? Or did he refuse it because he couldn't have bodyguards watching his every move? If you are living a double life, the last thing you want is a police officer standing outside your bedroom door or logging your movements in a secure diary. Security is a cage for a man with secrets. He needed the freedom of classy bond. He needed the lack of scrutiny. He needed to be able to disappear for a few hours. And that need for privacy, born of his darkest impulses, would ultimately leave him exposed to the one group that didn't care about his secrets, only his symbolism. The IRA didn't know about Kincora, or if they did, it wasn't their primary motivation. To them, he was simply the enemy. But in a twist of grim irony, the very vulnerability that the FBI had identified in 1944, that his private perversions made him a security risk, came true in the most literal sense. His desire for a life unpoliced, a life where he could indulge his sasties, meant that on that fatal August morning, there was no one checking the hull of the Shadow V. There were no frogmen sweeping the harbor. There were no armed guards on the dock. There was just an old man, his family, and a boat that had been sitting unguarded in the water all night, an easy target for a boy with a radio transmitter on the cliffs above. But protection breeds arrogance. By August 1979, ignoring the warnings of the RUC and his own security detail, Mountbatten returned to Classybon Castle in County Sligo. He refused close police protection. A man with secrets does not want a police log. He needs the freedom to disappear. That need for privacy left him fatally exposed. While Mountbatten played the carefree grandfather, Thomas McMahon, an IRA bomb maker, watched from the cliffs. He saw the Shadow V moored in the public harbor, unguarded. On the night of August 26th, McMahon slipped into the freezing water, climbed onto the boat, and packed 50 pounds of gelignite beneath the floorboards where Mountbatten always stood. Biographers and security experts have long debated this recklessness. Was it just the stubbornness of a senile old warrior, or was it something else? If we look at Mountbatten through the lens of the FBI files and the Kin Kora allegations, a different motivation emerges. A man with secrets does not want a police log. If Mountbatten was indeed living a double life, if he was receiving visitors at odd hours, if he was slipping away to meet young men, or if the whispers about his connection to the abuse ring in Belfast had any grain of truth, then heavy security was not protection. It was surveillance. Every bodyguard is a potential witness. Every police report is a permanent record. For a man who had spent 50 years curating a false image, the gaze of the state security apparatus was perhaps more terrifying than the vague threat of a terrorist bomb. He chose privacy over safety because his privacy was the vault where his true self was hidden. He needed the freedom to be Dickie, not Lord Mountbatten, even if that freedom left him fatally exposed. And exposed he was. While Mountbatten played the carefree grandfather on the beach at Malagmore, a man named Thomas McMahon was watching him through binoculars. McMahon was not a soldier in the traditional sense. He was an engineer of death, a skilled bomb maker for the South Armagh Brigade of the IRA. He was cold, professional, and patient. He knew Mountbatten's routine better than Mountbatten himself. McMahon saw what the security services feared. The Shadow V, Mountbatten's beloved 30-foot fishing boat, was a sitting duck. It was moored in the public harbor unguarded at night. It was a wooden vessel, old and slow, more sentimental than seaworthy. To McMahon, it wasn't a boat. It was a delivery system for a message. The weeks leading up to the assassination were a study in contrasting realities. Inside Classybon Castle, the mood was festive. Mountbatten was surrounded by his family. His daughter Patricia, her husband John Brayborn, his grandchildren, and the twin boys, Nicholas and Timothy. They were enjoying a classic Irish summer of rain, board games, and crab fishing. Meanwhile, just miles away, the final components of the bomb were being assembled. The IRA unit had procured 50 pounds of gelignite, a high explosive that is stable until detonated, but devastating when unleashed. They built a radio-controlled triggering mechanism, a sophisticated device for the time, designed to be detonated from the cliffs overlooking the bay. The tension was palpable to everyone except the target. On the night of August 26th, the weather turned. A dark, heavy mist rolled in off the Atlantic, shrouding the harbor in gloom. It was the perfect cover. While Mountbatten slept in his castle, dreaming perhaps of his glory days or the legacy he was crafting for Prince Charles, Thomas McMahon slipped into the freezing water of the harbor. He swam silently to the Shadow V. There were no guards, no police boat, no alarms. The invisible security Mountbatten had insisted on was, in practice, non-existent. McMahon climbed onto the boat. He lifted the floorboards near the steering position, the spot where Mountbatten always stood. He packed the gelignite carefully, wiring it to the receiver. It took him barely an hour. He then slipped back into the water and vanished into the night. The boat was now a floating coffin. The next morning, August 27th, dawned bright and clear. It was a bank holiday Monday. The sun burned off the mist, revealing a sparkling blue sea. It was, by all accounts, a perfect day for a trip. Inside the castle, there was the usual chaotic bustle of a family holiday. Breakfast was eaten, life jackets were gathered. The group that assembled to go down to the harbor was a tragic cross-section of innocence and experience. There was Mountbatten, the 79-year-old patriarch. There was his daughter, Lady Brabourne, 55, her husband, Lord Brabourne, the Dowager Lady Brabourne, 83, a grand old dame of the aristocracy, and the children, the 14-year-old twins, Nicholas and Timothy. Joining them was Paul Maxwell, a 15-year-old local boy from Enniskillen who had taken a summer job as a boat boy. Paul was thrilled to be working for the famous Lord Lewis. He was earning pocket money, learning about boats, and rubbing shoulders with royalty. He was the innocent bystander in a war he barely understood. As they walked down to the harbor, locals waved. Mountbatten waved back, the consummate performer to the very end. He stepped onto the Shadow V, taking his place at the helm. He fired up the engine. The vibrations of the motor masked the silent, deadly receiver beneath his feet. They cast off. The boat chugged slowly out of the harbor, past the breakwater, heading for the lobster pots a few hundred yards offshore. On the cliffs above, two men lay in the long grass, watching through a scope. One of them held a transmitter box. They waited until the boat was clear of the harbor walls, isolated against the blue water. At 11:30 a.m., a thumb pressed a button. The explosion was not a bang. It was a physical hammer blow to the air. The Shadow V didn't just break apart, it disintegrated. A massive column of water, timber, and debris shot hundreds of feet into the air. The sound rolled over the village of Malagmore like thunder, shaking windows and stopping hearts. In that fraction of a second, the carefully constructed world of Louis Mountbatten was atomized. The medals, the titles, the secrets, the FBI files, the whispers of Kin Kora, all of it was blown into the Atlantic wind. The scene in the water was apocalyptic. The local fishermen who had been waving moments before now raced their boats toward the cloud of smoke. They found a scene of horror. Mountbatten and young Nicholas were killed instantly. Paul Maxwell, the boat boy, was dead. The others were critically injured, floating in the oil-slicked water, their lives shattered forever. The IRA had got there spectacular. They had assassinated the Queen's cousin. But as the news flashed around the world, causing shock and outrage, a different kind of shockwave was moving through the intelligence communities in London and Washington. The Mountbatten file was now a dead man's file. The Kincora investigation, which had been inching closer to the truth, suddenly faced a massive, insurmountable obstacle. You do not indict a martyr. The bomb had done more than kill a man. It had created a saint. In the immediate aftermath, the narrative hardened instantly. Mountbatten was the hero, the victim, the symbol of British resilience. The complexities of his life, the dark allegations, the moral ambiguity, all of it was swept away by the sheer, brutal force of the tragedy. The assassination was a tragedy for the family, a crime against the children, and a political earthquake. But for the keepers of Mountbatten's secrets, it was, in a twisted, cynical way, a solution. The questions that were beginning to be asked would now be silenced out of respect for the dead. The investigations would lose their momentum. The unfit commander would be buried with full military honors, his reputation sealed in a lead-lined coffin. But secrets, like unexploded ordnance, have a way of resurfacing. The water settles, the debris washes ashore, and as the years passed, the silence that fell over Mullimore that day would eventually be broken, not by another bomb, but by the quiet, persistent voice of history demanding the truth. The silence that followed the explosion at Mullimore was heavier than the noise itself. For a few terrible seconds, the world seemed to hold its breath. The birds had stopped singing. The waves seemed to pause. Then the screams began. The Shadow V was gone. In its place was a widening slick of diesel oil, splintered wood, and the debris of a family holiday turned into a massacre. The local fishermen, men who knew the sea and its cruelties, were the first to react. They turned their boats toward the smoke, their engines screaming as they raced to the site. What they found in the water would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Lord Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, the supreme Allied commander, was floating face down, his body broken beyond recognition. He had died instantly, the blast tearing through the floorboards where he stood. Alongside him was his 14-year-old grandson, Nicholas. The boy had been sitting just feet away from his grandfather. He, too, was gone. Paul Maxwell, the 15-year-old boat boy from Enniskillen, a lad who had taken the job for a bit of summer pocket money and the thrill of working for royalty, was nowhere to be seen. His body would not be recovered until later. But amidst the death, there was the horror of survival. Mountbatten's daughter, Patricia, her husband, John, and their other son, Timothy, were alive but grievously injured. They were pulled from the water, their clothes blown off, their bodies peppered with shrapnel and wood splinters. The Dowager Lady Brabourne, 83 years old, was lifted gently into a fishing boat, barely conscious. She would die the next day in the hospital, bringing the death toll to 4. As the ambulances raced through the winding lanes of Sligo, carrying the broken remnants of the Mountbatten dynasty to Sligo General Hospital, the news began to ripple outward. It traveled first to the local Garda station, then to Dublin, and finally, via a secure line that hummed with panic, to Balmoral Castle in Scotland, where the Queen and the royal family were holidaying. The reaction at Balmoral was one of utter devastation. For the Queen, Uncle Dickie was more than a cousin. He was a link to her father, a constant presence in her life, a man who had helped steer the monarchy through the post-war years. But for Prince Charles, the blow was cataclysmic. Mountbatten had been Charles's honorary grandfather, his mentor, his confidant. In a family known for its emotional reserve, Dickie was the one person Charles could talk to. He was the man who had advised him on his love life, who had urged him to endure the rigors of Gordon Stoun's school, who had molded him into a future king. Charles wrote in his diary that day of a ghastly void opening up in his life. He was alone. And in that loneliness, a dangerous vulnerability took root, a vulnerability that would, in time, lead him to make catastrophic decisions about his own marriage to Lady Diana Spencer, whom Mountbatten had viewed as a potential bride for the prince. But while the family grieved, the machinery of the British state was moving with cold, hard efficiency. In London, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who had been in power for only a few months, received the news with a face of stone. She saw the assassination not just as a tragedy, but as an act of war. The IRA had struck at the very heart of the establishment. They had proven they could reach anyone, anywhere. Thatcher's response was immediate: a hardening of security, a crackdown on republicanism, and a vow that the terrorists would be hunted down. Within hours, the Provisional IRA issued a statement claiming responsibility. It was chilling in its bureaucratic language. They described the bombing as an execution. They stated, "This operation is one of the discriminate ways we can bring to the attention of the English people the continuing occupation of our country." To them, Mountbatten was not an old man on a boat. He was a symbol of imperialism, a legitimate military target who had once commanded the forces of the crown. The public revulsion was absolute. In Britain, the mood shifted from shock to fury. Mountbatten was instantly canonized. The newspapers filled with tributes to the hero of the empire. Stories of his bravery in World War II, his statesmanship in India, and his glamour were replayed on a loop. He became a martyr, a saint of the British cause, and this canonization was exactly what the intelligence services needed. In the shadows of Whitehall, a different kind of operation was underway. This was not a rescue mission. It was a containment operation. The death of Mountbatten had created a massive security vacuum. For decades, his personal files, his diaries, and his letters had been protected by his living presence. Now, they were vulnerable. There were rumors, never officially confirmed but persistent among historians, that within hours of the explosion, a team was dispatched to Mountbatten's home Broadlands in Hampshire. Their mission was to secure his papers. They were looking for anything that could damage the monarchy, anything that could be used for blackmail, anything that validated the whispers in the FBI files. What were they afraid of? They were afraid of the Mountbatten file. They were afraid of the letters from young men. They were afraid of any documentation that might link the late Earl to the darker corners of his life, specifically the allegations surfacing from Northern Ireland regarding the Kincora boys' home. The death of Mountbatten had a strange freezing effect on the Kincora scandal. Just weeks before the bombing, journalists and police investigators in Belfast had been inching closer to exposing the ring of abuse at the home. They were beginning to connect the dots between the paramilitary housefather, William McGrath, and high-ranking visitors. There was momentum. There was a sense that the dam was about to break. But when the bomb went off, the investigation hit a wall of silence. How could anyone accuse a man who had just been blown up by the IRA of being a pedophile? It was seen as distasteful, unpatriotic, even treasonous. To speak ill of Mountbatten in late 1979 was to side with the terrorists. The victims of Kincora, the boys who had been abused, who claimed to have seen the silver-haired VIP, were effectively silenced by the explosion. Who would believe them now? Who would listen to a terrorist sympathizer or a troubled youth over the eulogies of the entire Western world? The assassination provided the ultimate cover-up. It buried the allegations under a mountain of wreaths. The police investigation into Kincora slowed to a crawl. Files that might have implicated senior figures went missing. Officers were told to focus on more pressing security matters. The abuse ring at the home would eventually be exposed in the early 1980s, leading to the imprisonment of 3 staff members. But the links to the VIPs, to the intelligence services, and to Mountbatten were severed. The big fish were allowed to swim away in the chaos of the tragedy. Back in London, the preparations for the funeral began. It was to be the grandest state funeral since Winston Churchill's. Mountbatten had, true to his nature, planned it all himself years in advance. He had chosen the hymns, the route, the order of service. He had designed his own final exit with the same meticulous detail he applied to his uniforms. He wanted a spectacle. He wanted the world to see the glory of the empire one last time. But as the carriage was prepared and the troops drilled for the procession, there was a profound irony hanging over the proceedings. The establishment was preparing to bury a man they knew was deeply compromised. The Queen, the Prime Minister, the heads of MI5 and MI6, they all knew the rumors. They knew about the FBI files. They knew about the risk he had posed. Yet, they proceeded with the pageantry. Why? Because the myth was more important than the man. The monarchy relies on symbols to survive. Mountbatten was the ultimate symbol of continuity and duty. To expose him would be to crack the foundation of the institution itself. So they engaged in a collective act of amnesia. They buried the private man, the man of unnatural desires, the man of the open marriage, the man of the shadows, and they exalted the public hero. The media played its part. The BBC, the newspapers, the international press, they all adhered to the approved narrative. Mountbatten was the tragic victim. He was the grandfather who died holding his grandson's hand. The complexities of his life were airbrushed out. The Mountbatten jokes stopped. The whispers about boys ceased. It was a master class in reputation management. In death, Mountbatten achieved the perfection he had always chased in life. He was finally untouchable. But there were cracks in the facade. At the hospital in Sligo, his daughter Patricia lay in agony, her face stitched together, her body broken. She had lost her father and her son in a single second. Her grief was raw and messy, a stark contrast to the polished solemnity of London. In her pain, the reality of the violence was undeniable. This wasn't a state occasion, it was a family destroyed. And in the darker corners of Belfast, the survivors of Kincora watched the news coverage with a bitter, cynical eye. They saw the man they remembered as a predator being hailed as a saint. They saw the world mourning a monster. For them, the explosion hadn't brought justice. It had brought a final, crushing injustice. Their abuser had escaped earthly judgment, shielded by the very violence that killed him. As the date of the funeral approached, September 5th, 1979, London came to a standstill. The streets were lined with thousands of people. The Union Jack flew at half-mast. The silence was absolute. But inside the coffin, wrapped in the flag, lay a man whose life had been a kaleidoscope of contradictions. He was a hero who had defeated the Japanese, and a husband who had brokered a sexual truce with his wife. He was a mentor to kings and a man alleged to have preyed on the vulnerable. He was the architect of his own legend and the victim of his own hubris. The bomb had stopped his heart, but it hadn't stopped the truth. It had just paused it. As the gun carriage rattled through the streets of Westminster heading toward the Abbey, the secrets of Louis Mountbatten were marching right alongside him, invisible to the crowd, but heavy in the air. The Mountbatten enigma was being laid to rest, but it was a restless ghost, waiting for the time when the files would be unsealed and the real story could finally be told. September 5th, 1979, London. The day of the funeral was a masterpiece of somber theater, the kind the British establishment performs better than anyone else on earth. The sky was a pale, indifferent gray as the gun carriage bearing the coffin of Earl Mountbatten of Burma rattled over the cobblestones of Westminster. Drawn by 132 sailors of the Royal Navy, his beloved blue jackets, the procession moved with a rhythm that was both mournful and martial. The silence of the crowds lining the streets was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic thud of boots and the tolling of the abbey bells. Inside the coffin, draped in the Union Jack and topped with his admiral's cocked hat and sword, lay the remains of a man who had been, for nearly 80 years, a central pillar of the monarchy. But the man the world was mourning was a carefe, carefully curated fiction. The eulogy spoke of Dickie, the war hero, the last viceroy, the beloved uncle. They did not speak of the FBI files gathering dust in Washington. They did not whisper about the Mountbatten rumors that had circulated below decks for decades. And they certainly did not mention the terrifying allegations of abuse at Kincora that were, even then, being quietly suppressed by the very intelligence services standing guard along the route. Prince Charles walked behind the coffin, his face a mask of devastating grief. He was 30 years old, a man on the precipice of his own destiny, now utterly alone without his guide. In his uniform, he looked like a younger, sadder version of the man in the box. The bond between them had been profound, almost to Oedipal. Mountbatten had been the father figure Charles craved, dashing, affectionate, and relentlessly ambitious for him. Now, that voice was silenced. Inside Westminster Abbey, the congregation was a glittering assembly of kings, queens, prime ministers, and admirals. The air was thick with incense and history. As the choir soared, singing, "I vow to thee, my country," the irony was palpable to the few who knew the truth. Mountbatten had indeed vowed his life to his country, but his country had also vowed to keep his darkest secrets. The funeral was the final act of a lifelong performance. It was the sealing of the vault. As the coffin was lowered into the crypt at Romsey Abbey later that day, it felt like the end of an era. The Mountbatten century was over. But history, unlike a funeral, does not end when the coffin disappears. In the years that followed, the silence began to fracture. The first cracks appeared not in Britain, but in Ireland. The Kin Kora scandal, which had been smothered by the bomb, refused to die. In the early 1980s, 3 staff members at the home were convicted of systemic abuse. It was a victory for the victims, but a limited one. The big fish, the VIPs, the intelligence officers, the shadowy figures who had allegedly visited the home were never charged. However, the survivors did not stop talking. They spoke to journalists like Chris Moore and authors like Martin Dillon. They described a high-ranking visitor with silver hair and a posh English accent. They described being taken on yacht trips. They described a man who was treated with deferential fear by the housefather, William McGrath. Slowly, painfully, the name Mountbatten began to surface in the margins of the investigation. It was whispered in pubs in Belfast. It was scrawled on walls. It appeared in the notebooks of brave reporters. Then came the declassification of the FBI files. In the internet age, secrets are harder to keep. The American Freedom of Information Act forced the release of the Hoover dossiers. Suddenly, the world could read what J. Edgar Hoover had written in 1944. Homosexual with a perversion for young boys. Unfit for command. Low morals. These were not the ramblings of conspiracy theorists. They were the cold, hard assessments of the world's most powerful intelligence agency. The files corroborated the naval rumors. They aligned with the stories of the Mountbatten era. They gave weight to the Kincora allegations. Biographers like Andrew Loney began to piece together the fragments. They interviewed the surviving drivers, the valets, the bodyguards who had been sworn to secrecy. They found a pattern of predatory behavior that spanned decades. They found evidence of a man who used his immense power and charm to access vulnerable young men, shielding himself behind the unassailable wall of his royal status. The image of the hero began to dissolve, replaced by something far more complex and disturbing. Mountbatten was revealed not as a saint, but as a man of deep contradictions, a brave warrior who was also a moral coward, a devoted public servant who was privately reckless, a mentor to kings who may have been a monster to commoners. The revelation was painful for the British public. It forced a reckoning with the nature of power and deference. It asked a difficult question. How much did the establishment know? And if they knew, why did they do nothing? The answer, of course, lies in the very nature of the monarchy. It is an institution built on illusion. It requires its members to be symbols, not human beings. To expose Mountbatten would have been to admit that the system was rot. It would have damaged the Queen. It would have destroyed Prince Charles. So the system protected itself. It sacrificed the truth on the altar of stability. But the cost of that stability was high. It was paid by the victims of Kin Kora, who were denied justice. It was paid by the young men who were used and discarded. It was paid by a society that was lied to for generations. Today, the grave of Lord Mountbatten in Romsey Abbey is a place of pilgrimage for some, and a site of uneasy silence for others. He lies facing the sea toward the place where he died, but the shadow of his life stretches far beyond the churchyard. Prince Charles, now King Charles III, carries the legacy of his honorary grandfather in his heart. He often speaks of Mountbatten with love and reverence, but he rules a different world, a world where secrets are harder to keep, where deference is dead, and where the sins of the fathers are visited upon the sons. The story of Louis Mountbatten is a tragedy in the classical sense. It is the story of a man who had everything, birth, wealth, power, talent, but was undone by his own fatal flaw. He believed he could live outside the moral law. He believed his charm was a magic cloak that would hide his true nature forever. But the bomb in Sligo Bay did more than kill him. It shattered the mirror. It forced us to look at the shards and see the fragmented, ugly truth. We are left with a ghost story, not a story of a spirit haunting a castle, but of a reputation haunting a nation. The Mountbatten enigma is the ultimate cautionary tale of the 20th century. It teaches us that power without accountability is poison. It teaches us that heroes are often just people with better lighting. And it teaches us that no matter how deep you bury a secret or how high you build a monument to hide it, the truth will always eventually find a way to the surface. The water has settled over Mullimore. The Shadow V is gone, but the ripples are still spreading. Decades later, with the release of FBI files and the testimonies of survivors, the image began to dissolve. The Mountbatten enigma remains the ultimate cautionary tale. Power without accountability is poison. The bomb in Sligo Bay shattered the mirror, forcing the world to look at the shards and see the fragmented, ugly truth. The shadow fire is gone, but the ripples of what lay beneath the surface are still spreading.